Okay, we're continuing our study of Genesis, or creation versus evolution. This is tape and session number 14. The date is April 28th, 1995. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, we are in awe at the wonders and the truth of your word and the wonders of your creation. Father, how anybody can believe that it just happened by chance is beyond my reasoning, beyond any faith that I could possibly have to believe that. Father, we thank you that you've given us your word to tell us what you've done and when you did it. We thank you that you've given us your creation to testify to the truth of you and who you are. And we just pray, Lord, now as we look further at this subject, that you'd open our hearts and minds to understand and to receive your truth, and that you'd bind Satan by the blood, in the name of Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and that you guard and protect our hearts and minds from his attempt to blind us and confuse us with the lies and reasonings of the world. We thank you, Father, for what you're going to show us this evening now, and we thank you for all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, last week we basically finished our discussion of mutations and natural selection. I've got a few more comments to make about that, and then I'd like to give what I referred to at the end of last week's session, a mathematical illustration of the ridiculous improbabilities. Indeed, I use the word improbability technically, actually the impossibilities of evolution having occurred based on this matter of chance, or for that matter, anything else. Now understand, by the way, I'm going to just insert this every once in a while, I'm not saying that evolution couldn't possibly occur. God could have caused everything to come about by a process of evolution, and with him behind it. But that's not what the evolutionists are talking about. They're talking about really atheistic evolutionists. Theistic evolutionists, they just kind of tack God onto it. But the issue for us is, what does God say he did? And it's the Word of God that says the opposite of what the evolutionists say. And if God had done it by evolution, then his Word would have been consistent with that. Plus, if he had done it by evolution, we wouldn't find so many contradictions in the observations and data, which we can and do make. And so we wouldn't have any contradictions. Indeed, if he'd done it by evolution, and evolution therefore were true, then it would match the observations and data. But it doesn't. But we'll, in just a moment here, look at a mathematical illustration that's just a teeny little thing that's mind-boggling. Before we do, I want to just give you a couple of quick comments in closing on the subject of mutations and natural selection. And that is to make the point that the arguments that they give for mutations and natural selection are circular in their reasoning. Now, if you've heard of circular reasoning in logic, if you take a logic course, they teach you about the problem of circular reasoning. You cannot build sound reasoning on an assumption and a premise, draw a conclusion from that assumption and premise, and then use your conclusion to substantiate your premise. That's called circular reasoning. Now listen to this. This is a quote from Julian Huxley in the book he wrote, Evolution in Action. And he said this: on the basis of our present knowledge, natural selection is bound to produce genetic adaptations. Then he says, and genetic adaptations are thus presumptive evidence for the efficacy of natural selection. Now, I don't know if you got that. I mean, it's really simple on the one hand, but this kind of reasoning confuses people. People say, wait a minute, this is confusing. I don't get it. Well, the reason you don't get it is because it doesn't make any sense. And also, where do you start your thought process? You know, the question of what, don't answer this biblically now, but just the usual question that anybody will ask. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Okay? Now, we know the chicken came first because God created the chicken. But if you set God aside and his word aside for a moment and just think about chickens and eggs and forget how it really began, which is what the evolutionists do with their all their evolutionary thinking, you see. They just kind of start. With what? Well, with something, with that material out there, with the great cosmic egg, which then blew up, with the Big Bang. They always start with something. So let's start with something. Now, what are you going to start with? The chicken or the egg? Which comes first? You say, well, the egg came first. Well,
the egg ooze.
The egg ooze, yes. The egg ooze came first. Okay, so if the egg came first, how did it get there? Well, it had to come from a chicken. Well, how did the chicken get there? Well, it got there from an egg. And you see how that goes? Well, that kind of reasoning will shut down a computer. A computer will crash with that kind of reasoning, trying to come up with a solution to that problem, because it's circular in reasoning. Again, he says, based on our present knowledge, natural selection is bound to produce genetic adaptations. Then he says genetic adaptations are thus presumptive evidence for the efficacy of natural selection. Now he starts with, on the basis of our present knowledge. What's the present knowledge? That natural selection works. Okay? By producing these genetic adaptations. What's their evidence for that? The statement is, genetic adaptations are presumptive evidence for the efficacy of natural selection. But how does he get the genetic adaptations? He gets it with natural selection. So which one is the absolute fact from which he draws a conclusion? There is none. He's building each upon the other. Now, this is an otherwise intelligent person. We're going to be dealing tonight with fossils and fossil evidence, and the whole issue of fossils, the fossil record. And we're going to see that they also are just, I hope we get there, but if we, either tonight or next time, we'll be getting into the circular reasoning that they use, which is even worse than this, actually. Though all circular reasoning is bad, some is worse than others. Not all circular reasoning is equal. But actually it is all equal. It's all equally bad. But when you see it in the fossil record stuff, it's just phenomenal. But and again, these are intelligent people. But I got one quote from an evolutionist that's basically, giving some reasons why they use that kind of reasoning. Well, I'll read that for you later. So natural selection produces mutations, and mutations guarantee natural selection, but neither can be proved by itself. So that's what they're doing. And then we read a quote last week to this effect, but it was from a different individual, and I'll read this again to make this point, that natural selection is not actually an observed fact within the framework of natural life. Now, let me qualify my saying that. Natural selection, with the result of producing different organisms, as the evolutionists claim, of maintaining real change, does not exist in natural life. Here's a quote from J.B.S. Haldane in Nature magazine, in which he said, "In fact, natural selection with evolutionary consequences has only been observed where men have created drastically new conditions which impose a heavy selection pressure." Okay? Now that is either in the laboratory or where there's been, say, a population of creatures that have become extinct because of man encroaching upon some isolated and limited environment where they deprive them of their environment. And then it appears that they have gone extinct. And, of course, we have on the endangered species list, I don't know how many it is, hundreds, perhaps thousands of creatures that they have on the endangered species list because of the threat of them becoming extinct. And they always blame it on man and all that man is doing to the poor animal kingdom with man's cutting down the forests and building homes and bringing civilization into the wilderness and polluting and all these other things. I believe there's some validity to the concerns that people have in some instances, but I think most of it is blown out of proportion. But in any case, you don't find even there where these unnatural heavy selection pressures are brought because of man and his modern technology and expansion, etc., into their environments, the environments of these animals. You don't have these creatures doing anything but going extinct. So the natural selection is there. They're not able to survive as their environment changes by man bringing heavy pressure upon it. We don't have them changing. So that still doesn't do it, but in the laboratory where they'll try to bring certain changes and pass along mutational changes, etc., and they say, oh, look, natural selection then results in this change in this creature, such as in the fruit fly, for example, when they bombard it with radiation and make changes in their genes, etc. That's all an artificial situation where there's an aggressive, deliberate attempt to bring heavy selection pressure upon the creature experimentally in the laboratory. But as he says, in fact, natural selection with evolutionary consequences has only been observed where men have created drastically new conditions which impose a heavy selection pressure. In other words, it doesn't happen in real life. It doesn't happen out there in nature. So, having all our discussion last week and these few comments here now, natural selection is hardly proven when it can only be demonstrated under imposed conditions. And this whole process of chance through chance change through mutation, which we've seen by their own admission is almost always, if not in fact always, damaging to lethal, producing no new or real good, actual good changes of any kind, then these things don't work. There is no actual mechanism for bringing about this evolutionary change that they speak of through mutation and natural selection. Yes?
Just curious, do evolutionists believe in universalism, right?
Universalism in what sense?
That
Uniformitarianism. That's a totally different word. Okay.
I realize.
All right. Well, let's define it before you go any further, for those that may not know. Uniformitarianism is the idea that everything happens gradually and slowly and basically uniformly throughout the ages of time. Okay? And so therefore, what we see going on now is a reflection of what's gone on in the past. And therefore, they extrapolate that back to origins as well. Now, what's interesting about that is we don't see, as we're going to be commenting here, we don't see evolution taking place now. But nevertheless, that's what they believe. Go ahead.
Okay. Do they believe that the environment has made drastic changes, and that's where the need for the evolution has taken place? The only reason I bring that up is with bombarding those fruit flies. That's catastrophe in a sense.
Right.
And it's also, in order for that to be a legitimate experiment, you'd have to bombard all the world in a sense with the same amount of radiation in order to come up with.
It doesn't make any sense. Don't try to make any sense out of it. Let's not even waste our time trying to. It doesn't make sense.
As far as the environment, do they believe that they believe that there can be changes in the environment?
Well, that's the odd thing. They do believe indeed that what we have now is not what it was like back in the ancient times. And when you start with the primordial ooze and supposedly, boing, somehow out of that, life popped out of it, as we've discussed briefly in passing in this series, the experiments they've done to try to produce simplest so-called life form, they haven't produced any life forms. They've only produced some amino acids that combine together, which are building blocks of living things. But to do that, they have to build these special traps to immediately isolate the product of their experiment from the environment in which it occurred. Well, who was there to immediately isolate this life source or living thing, whatever it is, this living substance, which they refer to the properties of living substance. This living substance that suddenly kind of popped into existence and from this primordial ooze under these very drastic and unlivable conditions. Well, how was it isolated to protect itself and survive while that environment then gradually changes something else? Yes, they believe that the environment has changed drastically from the beginning until now on numerous occasions. And indeed, you'll see if you look at the evolutionary books, and especially the Time Life series, they've got all kinds of fabulous drawings about different ages and how they looked. And they all look quite a bit different. But so the uniformitarian idea is that these things have gradually and slowly changed and that there's no universal catastrophes. That's why I said, by the way, the word uniformitarian is very much different from the word universal or universalism. Because they do not believe, generally speaking, they do not believe in universal catastrophes, such as the worldwide flood. They will not accept that. It's all happened slowly and gradually and uniformly, even if there's been major changes from one great age to another great age. It's happened slowly and uniformly over a period of time. Though oddly, when certain things are brought to their attention, they then begin to do what they always do with their theory. They start making new sub-hypotheses and little amendments to their program to make it somehow work. And they then start inserting, oddly enough, major catastrophes, such as a huge meteor hitting the Earth and blowing up such a dust cloud that it caused the dinosaurs to go extinct. So when it suits them, they're into catastrophe, and they contradict their own uniformitarian views, because their uniformitarian views don't hack it. They don't result in evolution happening. Now, they often will bring up examples of how mutation and natural selection has worked. Let me give you two references on that. One is the peppered moth. There's a moth, and I don't know if it lives elsewhere, but I know that it lives in England, or at least did, if they're still there. This peppered moth, prior to the Industrial Revolution, peppered moths were light in color. Now, peppered moths come in a variety of, not colors, but in shades and, if you will, modeling. Some are kind of solid, dark, some are solid light, some are speckled, okay? And they were basically, the population of peppered moths were basically light. During the Industrial Revolution, and through the Industrial Revolution, by the end of the Industrial Revolution in England and worldwide, by the way, the environment became very polluted, and the peppered moth population became essentially dark. And this is viewed as an adaptation to the environment through mutation and natural selection. And they say, see how the moth changed to adapt to its environment. And they then will point out that after the Industrial Revolution they started cleaning it up, when people started to realize, well, hey, we're polluting ourselves here. Let's try to clean it up, because it was pretty bad. And people talk about pollution today. It's nothing compared to what it was during the Industrial Revolution. And as they then cleaned up the environment, the moths then, quote unquote, adapted, according to the evolutionists, back to a light population to conform to their environment through, they say, mutation and natural selection. Well, there's some observations we'll make about that. First, during each period where they were primarily light, then primarily dark, and then primarily light again, all three, and I'm using three just to isolate types of moths of the color variation. There were light moths, peppered type moths, that's why they're called peppered moths. They're mostly light, then some that are definitively peppered, and others that are mostly dark. In each period of time, you had all three kinds. But the reason, in fact, now I'm going to interpret the observation myself instead of going with their interpretation. Their interpretation is mutation and natural selection. But what was going on there actually, I believe, is that in the light environment, before it became polluted and dirty and everything became black, trees, everything got black from the Industrial Revolution. Well, as it got darker and darker, the light moths would be eaten more readily by birds and other predators because they stood out more in the environment as they remained light and the environment got darker. So what happened is the numbers shifted, so you had then more predominantly the dark moths that predominated because they blended in better to the dark environment and weren't eaten as often as the light moths. So the population numbers shifted. And then as the environment got cleaned up and it went back, then it got lighter again, then the dark moths began to be eaten at a greater frequency than the light moths, and the population numbers, color numbers, shifted again. That's all that happened there. Furthermore, the peppered moth is still a peppered moth. The peppered moth has not even remotely come close, not even a little teeny bit, to becoming a butterfly or some other creature. Well, forget that. I mean, if it hasn't even become another winged creature, it certainly hasn't become an elephant. So the point I'm making is that the peppered moth is not an illustration of anything regarding mutation and natural selection. The other one is the fruit fly, the Drosophila fruit flies that are used in the laboratory. I've heard about these all of my life. I don't know when they started doing their experiments on them, but probably I'm going to guess in the 1940s when radiation became, readily available. Because what they do is they use the fruit flies because fruit flies have a very short life cycle, so that they're able to reproduce many times over during one's experimental life when you're giving your life to experimentation. And they can observe hundreds, perhaps, when I first wrote up these notes, which go back nearly 30 years, there were over 1,000 generations had been observed at that time. Now, I don't know whether it's now like 2,000 or 3,000 generations. I'm not sure what it is. But it's obviously a lot of generations that normally in life and animals and people, for sure, nobody can observe that. Everybody dies off before a generation or two has gone by. So because of this, they're able to observe the results, the effects of mutation and change in the gene structure of these fruit flies over hundreds of generations. An individual could observe at least hundreds, if he's stuck with the job, of generations of fruit flies. So what they do is they bombard them with radiation, causing damage to the gene structure, and therefore resulting in changes in their morphology, changes in their appearance, changes in their eyes. Some of them became blind. Some of them had no eyes at all. Some of them had an extra eye. Some had extra legs, some were short, locked legs, some had stubby legs, some had extra wings, some had no wings. There's all these variations in the changes that occurred as a result of doing damage to this otherwise perfectly designed little bug called the Drosophila or fruit fly. And that, of course, is fine with me. I don't like fruit flies. They bother me when they're buzzing around me. I don't like fruit flies. But, God has some purpose for them. I don't know what it is, just like I don't know what his purpose for mosquitoes is, and I do have that question for him. I'm holding that for when I see him. But the point I'm making is this. They've made these radical changes. I say radical. I mean, that's probably not the right word in this context. These significant changes in the appearance and structure of the fruit fly in terms of changing their eyes, their legs, their wings, etc. But not one single fruit fly has come out better off for the process.
So are you saying mutations cause mutants?
Mutations cause mutants. That's correct. And the mutants die, or if they don't die, if they were in the natural environment, they would be killed by the other creatures, because anything that is mutant in the natural environment is usually killed off by others of its like kind. But in this case, it's not even necessary. These things can't survive. When you have a fruit fly that now has 3 wings instead of 2 wings, it's not able to fly. So extra wings don't make an improvement for a fruit fly. Having less legs or more legs does not improve it. Having an extra eye does not improve their vision at all. Even if it was a working eye, it does not improve their vision. Just distort your eye just a little bit and see what it does to your vision. So imagine having a third eye now, suddenly and mutantly there. It's not going to improve your vision. But what they've gotten over, I'm going to say probably at least 2,000 generations, what have they gotten? What do they have now? They have mutant fruit flies. They don't have anything that's remotely turning into any other kind of fly, let alone into any other kind of a major creature. None of these fruit flies have even made one teeny move toward becoming birds. None of them have developed feathers. There is nothing about these fruit flies that have changed other than being damaged, being bad goods. And often they're not able to reproduce, or if they are able to reproduce, they reproduce again more mutant, non-functional flies. So those are 2 examples that are used by evolutionists to try to demonstrate the supposed efficacy of mutation and natural selection. They don't demonstrate any such thing.
That's ongoing. They're still doing that, right?
Oh yeah, they're going to do it and do it and do it, and suppose it's with the see they believe in evolution, so they believe if they do it long enough and often enough that it's going to finally show a positive change toward the direction of another creature. Yes, Michael.
So the mutations that that come upon these little bugs, they don't in any way, or they can't change the genetic information, so it would become something else. Is that what you're saying?
Okay, first of all, they're not trying to specifically change it into a designed another creature. They're trying to let random chance and change, because that's what mutations in natural selection are all about. It's random, it's chance. There's no design in it. So they just bombard it with this energy called radiation and let chance do its work. And by chance, it does damage here and damage there, and it's just that. It's always damage, never an improvement. They're hoping for an improvement by chance, but it hasn't and doesn't happen.
But for an improvement to happen, wouldn't that have to be change in the genetic information?
Okay, yes. And by the way, that's what this is all about. What we're talking about is the radiation. Usually the radiation they put on these fruit flies doesn't change the fruit fly that they're bombarding. It changes his genetic structure, his reproductive DNA, so that when he reproduces a mutant offspring because of a change in the genetic material. That's exactly what they're doing.
But they think these things can and do evolve, where we say they reproduce after their own kind.
Well, okay. The whole point is they believe that with random change through mutation to genetic material in any living creature, when you give it enough time and enough occurrences, that eventually it's going to by chance produce a good change, which will then add up with an occasional another good change, with the result ultimately, as it keeps on doing this, of a changed creature who's able to survive better than the other ones because it has this good change in it, and that then building upon that step after step after step for this great eons of time produces the evolutionary process of change into higher, more organized, better organisms. That's the idea. And they're trying to demonstrate that, but they haven't been able to demonstrate it. They keep getting bad results instead of any quote-unquote good result. Okay? But it all has to do with the genetic material. Okay. Now, you ask the question, why can't we see evolution in this process? Now, forget the peppered moth, because we're not seeing it there and we know why. But if you just take this fruit fly, why aren't we seeing evolution take place there? And their answer is that evolution takes place too slow to see it. Even with the thousands of generations, that's still a drop in the bucket compared to the eons of biological time. And so nobody lives long enough to see it. But, there's these great eons of time. There's so much time. It's just slow, and it happens. I mean, after all, look, it has happened. You see? That's what they say. So then you turn to another area of evidence, which we're going to do in a few minutes, and that then is the fossil record. So we're going to go back into the supposed ancient times, and we're going to look for evolution there. But before we do, I want to use this, share with you this mathematical illustration of the improbability. I'm using that as a statistical term. The improbability of evolution happening by chance through mutation and natural selection. Now, the idea is this, again. If you remember in our quote from Huxley on the evolution of the horse, he admitted that he was probably giving himself the benefit of the doubt to say that maybe one mutation out of 1,000 might be okay, might be good, everything else being bad. And therefore, he says, to accumulate 1 million good mutations together in a row, because he said, after all, it does take 1 million mutations to evolve a horse. I don't know how he came up with that. But nevertheless, So to get 2 good mutations in a row, it's 1 out of 1,000 times 1 out of 1,000. That's 1 out of 1,000,000 to get 2 good mutations in a row. The chances against it are, or in favor of it, are only 1 out of 1,000,000 to get 2 good ones in a row. Okay? So you get finding a good one, and you somehow have to save that good one and link it up by chance with another good one. Well, the odds against that are immediately very heavy against that. And he used 1 out of 1,000, and he admitted he was giving himself the benefit of the doubt. Well, I don't want to pick on these guys too hard, so let's really give them the benefit of the doubt and also simplify the numbers. Get them down to something we can think about a little easier. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to, in this illustration, quote-unquote, evolve from a 1-part organism to a 200-part organism. Now, I mentioned to you last week that according to some authorities, I understand that just the nucleus of our living cells in our bodies contains sometimes more than 1,000,000 parts. I can't even grasp that. I don't even know how they can figure that out. But I believe that it's true. And they didn't discover that. They thought the nucleus of the cell was a single thing, just a single unified thing, until they got the electron microscope. And through the electron microscope, they discovered that that cell is made up of this incredible number of functional parts. But we're only going to evolve from a 1-part organism. I'm not even talking about, well, an arm is being 1 part and another arm is 2 parts. Okay, I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about just take a single cell that is by itself unified as one thing, and there's nothing more than this empty cell, so to speak. But somehow it's alive. You have to have that with the evolutionists. Remember the quote from where he spoke about due to the properties of living substance? Okay, so we're going to take this 1-part cell as living substance, and we're going to let that cell evolve, not into a bunch of cells, but just let it evolve by mutation and chance into a 200-part cell. That's not very complicated compared to the real cells that we have in our bodies. Okay, so we're going to evolve from 1 part to 200 parts through random mutation in this illustration. Now, the odds against getting mutations, let me go back a notch. Let's say that 1 out of every 2 mutations is a good one. Now you can see that I'm doing more than giving them the benefit of the doubt when I say that. Let's say that out of every 2 mutations, 1 of them is a good mutation, something worth keeping and passing along, okay, that results in fact, just that single mutation results in another part. So if you get 1 good mutation in this organism, this 1-part organism, it's now a 2-part functional organism. That, of course, is also a rash assumption. But let's go ahead and do that, okay, for sake of illustration. And so if it can accumulate 200 good mutations in it together, it will now have mutated from a 1-part to a 200-part functional organism, okay, through random mutation and change. Now that means, therefore, that get 2 good mutations in a row, you have 1 out of 2 for 1. To get 2, you have 1 out of 2 times 1 out of 2. Do you understand that mathematically? You multiply 1/2 times 1/2. Now the odds in favor of it happening are 1 out of 4 chances. Okay? If you have a coin with a head and a tail on it and you throw it, what are the odds of getting a head instead of a tail? What are the odds?
1 out of 2.
1 out of 2. Everybody understands that, I think. Now, okay, say, all right, I'm going to let you throw it twice and see if you can get 2 heads in a row. What are the odds of doing that? The odds are 1 out of 4 of getting 2 in a row. Okay? Let me illustrate that. Okay? If you threw the first one and got a tail instead of a head, you didn't get it. So the next throw wouldn't get it either. Okay? And then if you threw a head the first time and the second time you threw a tail, wouldn't get it. You do this and the odds just start increasing against it, and it's very small numbers after you add them up. So 1 out of 2 times 1 out of 2, that's to get 2 good things, is 1 out of 4. Well, to get 200 good parts all in one organism by mutation and by chance alone is 1 out of 2 raised to the 200th power. 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2, 200 times. And what that ends up being is 1 out of 10 to the 60th. 1 out of 10 to the 60th. Now forget what that number is for a moment as far as trying to make a number out of that, calling it something, and I say, is that a million or a billion, or a trillion? Well, it's way more than that.
10 with 60 zeros.
It's a 10 with 60 zeros behind it. And that number doesn't even probably have a name. But whatever, it's one chance out of 10 to the 60th to get 200 good mutations in a row in our organism.
When you say 60th, you're not talking about 60th power, you're just talking about 60th, 60 zeros after it.
10 to the 60th.
The number is 10 to the 60th power, which is a 1 with 60 zeros written after it. But it's easier to write 10 to the 60th power than it is to write 1 with 60 zeros after it. Okay? It's also easier to talk about. I can't describe 1 with 60 zeros after. I have no name for that. So we're going to call it 10 to the 60th. Also, for mathematics, it's much easier to work with adding and subtracting exponents to make the numbers work out. We'll see that as we go. Now, in order to have this occur, we have to have, statistically, we have to have 10 to the 60th trials. That is, this is a chance. So we're going to take a chance, and what will happen? What happens if I flip the coin 200 times? That would be one trial to see if I could get 200 in a row. Now, of course, you wouldn't keep throwing 200 times. If you threw a tail the first time, you'd say, okay, there's one trial done and finished, because you didn't get, a head to get 200 heads in a row. But regardless, you'd have to have a total of 10 to the 60th trials in order to try to achieve one good one statistically. Okay, you understand what I'm saying now? You have to have 10 to the 60th tries, attempts to, by chance, get this one good combination of 200 good parts together. All right? Now, the evolutionists say, hey, we have a long time, and it's a big Earth, so no problem. Let's do it. All right, now, how many trials can we accomplish? And here's what we're going to do. We're going to, if you take this organism, we're going to let this organism mutate 200 times per second. Did you hear what I said? 200 times every second. Now that, of course, is totally ridiculous. Things hardly mutate in a lifetime by chance. Most organisms never mutate. Okay? That's demonstrated with the fact that, for the most part, for example, human beings or animals keep reproducing generally good stuff, They don't come up with bad stuff as a rule. They come up with good stuff. Mutations don't happen that frequently in nature. But we're going to allow, in this illustration, we're going to allow this one part organism to mutate 200 times every second. So that in 1 second, one organism mutates 200 times in a full second, so that it goes through an entire trial in 1 second, just like that. The next second, it goes through another trial. All right? Now, again, I'm giving the benefit of the doubt here, right? Now, how many trials can we accomplish? The square foot surface of the Earth is 10 to the 14th square feet. All right? That's 10 to the 14th is, I think, like 100 billion square feet. I don't remember if that's right or not, but I think that's the number. But anyway, 10 to the 14th square feet. Now, we're going to just pretend the whole surface of the Earth is a perfect environment for these creatures to live and to mutate on. We're not going to deal with the fact that some's on land and some is on water. We say that every square foot on the whole surface of the Earth is a perfect environment for these things to go at it and to mutate and mutate and mutate in this attempt. All right? So we got 10 to the 14th square feet. We're going to put on each square foot 1 billion organisms. On every square foot of the whole surface of the Earth, and every one of these is going to mutate 200 times every second. So 1 billion organisms on every square foot of the whole surface of the Earth are all going to mutate through an entire cycle of mutations, 200 every second.
The problem is you have an overpopulation.
We're giving them the benefit of the doubt here, okay? Now, 1 billion is 10 to the 9th times 10 to the 14th square feet. That means that all over the surface of the earth now we're going to have 10 to the 23rd organisms mutating every second. By the way, when you multiply numbers with the same base, in this case 10, a 10 with an exponent times a 10 to the with another exponent, you add the exponents when you multiply them. If you divide, you subtract. So 10 to the 9th times 10 to the 14th, that's the number of organisms times the number of square feet, that's 10 to the 23rd organisms all over the whole surface of the earth, all mutating just like crazy, 200 times a second. Now, that's a big earth. Now we have a lot of time, okay? Because after all, they've got all this vast time in evolution, right? 4.5 billion years age of the earth, 2 billion years of biological life. Well, just for a nice round figure, let's say that they have 10 billion years. Not 2 billion of biological time. Let's say they got 10 billion years. All right? Let's give them lots of time, more than they're even asking for. 10 billion years of biological time. Now, there are 10 to the 18th seconds. Hours, minutes, seconds. 10 to the 18th seconds in 10 billion years. Okay? So the total time we're giving them in this experiment is 10 to the 18th seconds of time. That means that every organism gets to mutate 200 times a second and complete a complete trial every second. Therefore, each one gets to mutate and try to complete its trial 10 to the 18th times. Now, 10 to the 18th times of trials per organism times 10 to the 23rd organisms is 10 to the 41st. That's how many trials we can accomplish through this process. Okay? All right, that's how many trials you can accomplish. Now, how many trials do we need? We need 10 to the 60th. But we've only, through this illustration, accomplished 10 to the 41st power trials. Now, do you know what the odds are against it happening if we give all those parameters and accomplish 10 to the 41st trials in 10 billion years? What are the odds against it happening? Anybody know?
1 out of 10 to the 17th.
19th. 41 from 60.
41, I was thinking 42.
Okay, 41 from 60. You remember when you divide? To figure it out, you divide how many trials you got and how many you need, and that's how many more times you have to have it happen. So 10 to the 60th trials requires 10 to the 19th times as many trials as we actually accomplished, which is 10 to the 41st. See, if you have 10 times more trials, it's 10 to the 42nd. 100 times more trials is 10 to the 43rd. And it goes on up. So you need 10 to the 19th, that many more times 10 to the 41st number of trials in order to accomplish 10 to the 60th trials. Now, I'm taking a little long on this, but I want you to really grasp what I'm saying about these numbers. Let's back up a notch and make it even a little more to their favor. Instead of 10 billion years of biological life, let's give them 100 billion years. That's only 10 more times, so that'll only be 10 to the 41st. Okay, let's give them, instead of 100 billion years, let's give them 1,000 billion years. That's a trillion. And 1,000 is now 10, it's 100 times more. That's 10 times 10. Now it's 10 to the 43rd if we give them a trillion years. They're only talking about the whole universe being 18 to 20 billion years old. 18 to 20 billion, which is 1/50th of a trillion. And biological life is only 2 billion years. We're going to give them a trillion years.
That's 1,000 billions.
That's 1,000 billions. A trillion is 1,000 billions.
But you did that already. But that was 10 to the 43rd.
It is, I'm just going back and saying what I'm giving them. That is 10 to the 43rd trials now, because we've just given them a trillion years instead of 10 billion years. Now we have 10 to the 43rd trials. The odds against, in a trillion years, one little one-part cell evolving into a 200-part cell by mutation 200 times every second with all 1 billion per square foot on the whole surface of the Earth, and just one of these guys ever evolving into a 200-part organism by this method, in 1 trillion years, the odds are still 1 out of 10 to the 17th against it happening. 10 to the 17th. What is 10 to the 17th? Anybody know what 10 to the 17th is? Well, while we're thinking about that, we'll pause, turn over the tape, and we'll come up with that number. Just pause for a moment.